What Starmer doesn't understand, and when he says, I'm going to stop the far right, what he doesn't understand is the general feeling of dissatisfaction that has been out there in this country growing for years. I talked in the general election about societal breakdown. What I meant by that were communities being split apart. People not even recognising the centres of some of our towns and cities as even being vaguely English anymore.
Nigel Farage has proposed a plan to address the UK's growing unrest and rising riots, driven by his belief that mass immigration and policing issues are at the core of the problem. He argues that recent increases in the UK population, driven by immigration, have strained public services and housing, leading to widespread dissatisfaction.
Well, the race to replace Rishi Sunak as Conservative Party leader is, of course, well underway, and one person who hopes to take the reins is the former Government Minister Mel Stride, who joins us now. Very good morning to you, Mr. Stride.
Good morning, Will.
Thanks for joining us. Let's touch on the riots and the events of the last 10 days first, if we can. Are you encouraged by the news flow overnight?
Yes, undoubtedly, because there could have been 100 incidents across the country, and it appears that there's been very little violence last night. I think that is a tribute to the police. I think they have done a very good job in getting in amongst the situation, taking robust policing, getting that balance right, and also, of course, getting the judiciary involved, getting people through the courts. We've already seen some sentences meted out already as a clear deterrent to those that would otherwise get involved in this mindless thuggery that we've seen over the last few days.
Is it also, therefore, at least in part a tribute to the government? I mean, it's one of those topics in the last couple of days, been asking many of your fellow Conservatives, and there's been some slightly different answers about whether this is a moment where you step back and ultimately back the government and applaud them for the work that they're doing, or whether you want to nitpick at minor details.
So this has been a really difficult moment for our country, a moment of fairly acute crisis. And I do think, and I think this is the point you're making, that in those situations, it's very important that oppositions and everybody in public life does what they can to be moderate and take robust action, certainly, but also be moderate in the way that we approach it. And I think that does extend to the view that one takes of the actions of the government. The reality is that the police have done an extraordinarily, I think, good job in very, very difficult circumstances. The reality is that the judiciary has stepped up. We have seen a number of people, hundreds of people now arrested. We've seen people going through the courts. We've seen sentences.
To tackle these issues, Farage suggests three main actions. First, Farage calls for an immediate halt to mass immigration. He contends that the UK's significant population increase, totaling about 10 million people in recent years, has exacerbated pressures on public services and housing, fueling social tensions.
Sentences meted out, that has been a deterrent, and I think we should recognise that as a success.
Was your fellow leadership candidate, Robert Jenrick, on this show an example of someone who wasn't moderate enough and supportive of enough?
Well, I think you might be referring to the remarks that Robert made about the use of the term.
Precisely. He said, I thought it was quite wrong that somebody could shout Allahu Akbar on the streets of London and not be immediately arrested.
Well, I would disagree with that position, because I don't think that in all circumstances that somebody shouts that term on a street in London, they should immediately be arrested. Now, that doesn't detract from the fact that where there is clear intimidation, where there is clear incitement to violence, engagement in violence, etc., that there shouldn't be a robust response. And Robert and I are in total agreement in terms of not tolerating any of that kind of behaviour. I think one element of this debate that has been skated over and shouldn't have been actually are the remarks made by Nigel Farage, for example, when the terrible incident in Southport first occurred. His suggestion that the police might have not been telling the truth about that situation, I think, helped fuel conspiracy theories around what was happening, was deeply unhelpful. I think linking what happened in Southport with the terrible incident that happened regarding a uniformed soldier in Kent over the last week is also a very unfortunate linkage, and particularly suggesting that perhaps terrorism might have been involved when the authorities are saying that it hasn't. And I think those things are examples of the kind of language and interventions that at a moment of crisis are deeply unhelpful. And I think that's why we need level heads and moderation, as well as very firm action. And we have seen very firm action.
That's very interesting.
Farage advocates for denying refugee status to those arriving by small boats across the English Channel, proposing that these individuals should be detained and deported rather than accommodated in public housing or hotels. Second, Farage wants a crackdown on what he describes as Islamic extremism.
Interesting to hear you say that as regards to some things Nigel Farage said. But just to come back to the line from Robert Jenrick, I mean, your comment there that followed it was to say, I don't think in all circumstances saying Allahu Akbar should be seen as wrong. Surely it's the other way around entirely, that in very, very few circumstances where there are a lot of other factors at play, it can be something that could even vaguely be considered to be in the wrong. Your statement to Sky News yesterday, I said, I think the suggestion of wholesale criminalisation of the words Allahu Akbar is unwise and insensitive. You don't want to go further than that?
Well, no, what I'm saying, Wilf, is very clear, is I just don't agree with the statement that says that effectively under all circumstances where somebody shouts those words that translate as God is great or God is the greatest, that they should be immediately arrested. I just don't think that is an appropriate position to take.
He came out later in the day and rather than apologise or retract the statement, he sort of tried to explain it and justify it. Is he someone, if you won and became party leader, that you'd like to put back in the position he used to have, immigration or shadow immigration?
So, look, I'm not going to speculate about what any candidate might do in the event that they win and the kind of shadow cabinet they might construct. Look, I'm not going to get into that, Wilf. I mean, the reality is I've made my statement about what I think the situation should be around this particular issue of the use of that language on the street. I don't think it should automatically lead to an arrest. I accept, of course, there are certain circumstances or contexts in which, for example, that language might be being used at the same time as a number of illegal and unlawful actions being taken. And then, of course, arrest might be appropriate. But the term itself is typically used within Islam in a gentle and positive way. It's used within the process of religious observance. It's often used as a positive statement in itself. So I don't think we should be in a position where we're saying, well, anybody who uses those words on the street in London, shouting, to be fair, was the term used, should automatically be arrested. I just don't think that is an appropriate position to take. Now, I've made that position clear and I really say no more than that.
In terms of the leadership race and what you hope for the Conservative Party going forward if you were to win, is this a 10-year plan? Could it be a 4 or 5 year plan before the Conservatives are back in power, or is that unrealistic?
So, Wilf, if we have the right leader who unites the party and does the hard yards of the policy platform development that we will need to reach out to those people that we lost to reform, and there are issues there around migration, net migration, lower taxation, but equally appreciate the fact that we've got to reach out to those Labour and Liberal Democrat voters who were previously Conservatives. We've got to do both those things. If we can do that and we can reform our party machine so that it is a really powerful, dynamic, local campaigning machine, and that needs a lot of reform, and we need to do one in the elections in May as a consequence of that reform, then we can get back in one term. This is a government that got in with the lowest share of the popular vote of any government in history. In fact, of those that were able to vote in this election, only 1 in 5 voted Labour. It is quite possible for us to turn this around in one cycle and to win the next general election. But we need the right leader to do that fundamental change that the party needs now in order to get into contention.
Thanks so much for joining us. Very good to see you.
Thank you.
He argues that certain minority groups, particularly Muslims, have differing responses to societal issues compared to the white British population. Farage believes that a tougher stance is needed against these groups, suggesting that the authorities should monitor and suppress what he views as extremist threats more aggressively.
Nigel Farage needs no introduction. He's our mate in the United Kingdom, of course, the leader of the Reform Party and a parliamentarian now, of course, after the most recent UK election. Nigel, lovely to see you. Also good to see you back on GB News as well. But I've got to ask you, one of the things that you reiterated at almost every rally when you were in the lead up to the election was that you had purged political parties of the far right, that you had gone hard against all of these people, yet amazingly and unsurprisingly, despite your proven track record of doing that, the media is trying to pull you into the worst elements of what we've been seeing in the past few days.
Yes, it's been despicable. I mean, broadcasters saying these are Farage's riots, prominent Labour politicians. This is what Nigel Farage wanted. As if somehow I'm responsible, some even suggesting that I'm orchestrating the riots. I've spent 30 years fighting elections, believing that is the way to solve problems in society, not to resort to violence. I've never gone anywhere near, I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. Members of the extreme right who say very provocative things like Tommy Robinson or the others, the reason they hate me, the reason they're blaming me is twofold. The first is the Labour Party are terrified that many of their own voters will vote for me, because when Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, says everything that's happening is the fault of the far right, well, yes, of course, there are some far right thugs behaving appallingly, but actually, when it comes to being concerned about mass immigration, when it comes to being concerned about societal breakdown, when it comes to being worried that many of our towns and cities are no longer recognisable as even being English, if you use that term.
Third, Farage proposes a reform of policing tactics across the UK. He asserts that police forces should adopt a more impartial approach, eliminating racial discrimination.
Far right, you're using it against your own voters and a majority of the population. That's the first reason they're attacking me. They're scared of me politically. The second reason is I was right. I said last Wednesday that unless we cleared up some of the conspiracy theories on social media by telling us the truth about who this young man was that stabbed to death those 3 little girls at that Taylor Swift party, unless we sorted it out, then I said I felt the country was on the verge of revolt. Well, we didn't clear up the mess, and we have had a revolt. So they secondly hate me because I was right.
What I find so dishonest by those who again seek to tar the people that have spoken about a very obvious issue, right? So say illegal border crossings, right? Now, very obviously, you can have an absolute passionate view on that issue. That does not mean that you endorse somebody breaking into the places where some of those people who illegally enter the country end up. This is what I find, again, the maliciousness in and around this. I mean, we can sit here for the next 8 minutes doing what I know you've done on your show in the UK and what we've done here, which is the riots are despicable. They are not acceptable. Everyone who's involved in the violence must be held to account, just like anyone else who does it. But that doesn't mean you can't.
Farage highlights that stop-and-search operations disproportionately target black neighbourhoods, and he calls for an end to this practice. He believes that equal treatment for all, regardless of race or ethnicity, will reduce tensions and improve relations between communities and law enforcement.
Can't have the view about, does a country have a border and are you allowed to police it?
Well, that's right. And one of the fears here, by Starmer saying we're going to crack down on the far right, we're going to use video imaging, one of the worries is that they actually try to suppress that debate even further, whilst effectively turning a blind eye to marauding gangs of masked Muslim young men walking around some of our cities in a very intimidatory way. Don't misunderstand me. Most of the thuggery has been young white males setting fire to things and behaving terribly. But it's not as if it's just one side that's at fault with all of this. Now, I really worry that Starmer may use this to try and suppress debate, to suppress free speech, to make it even harder to talk about these issues. And no one's spoken out more, Paul, than me about the cross-channel migrants, the young men, undocumented young males who ISIS themselves have said they'll put their operatives into our country through this route. And yet, when I was out there 3 years ago, in the Channel and there were two young men that capsized from a dinghy, there I was physically putting them out of the English Channel. And the fact you think something's wrong doesn't mean you're subhuman.
100%, 100%. Let's talk quickly about the economies of the world that have all had a jitter in the past couple of days. And geez, what an absolute reminder about what is the choice before the American public here, where Kamala Harris, who just word salads her way through an explanation of inflation, would have no idea what lever to pull.
No, and of course what we're learning is that the Americans have been ever so slightly playing games with the economic figures as this election approaches, and as the truth got out towards the end of last week that the American economy is slowing, that the Fed have not reduced interest rates as quickly as they ought to. We've seen some precipitous downward moves on stock markets, Japan, of course, being perhaps the biggest example. But I think we're now entering a period of economic reality. We're living way beyond our means. Debt is much, much worse at a governmental, corporate and individual level than it was back in 2008. Growth in most countries is anemic. Growth even in America is not quite as good as people thought it was. And whilst I'm not on your show to make stock market predictions, I think we're in for a very, very bumpy autumn on the stock exchanges as this reality begins to bite.
I think so, and depending on the choices that are made in the next little while about whom that VP is, well, a whole bunch of stuff's going to happen in Chicago, let alone the court process revving up again against Trump. It'll be fascinating to watch. Thankfully, we get to talk.
While Farage's proposals have gained some support, they have been met with significant criticism. Opponents argue that his approach could further marginalise minority communities and worsen social divisions. Critics claim that his rhetoric may incite more hatred and violence rather than address the underlying causes of unrest.
Well, it's been a pretty appalling couple of days. Violence on the streets of this country that we haven't seen for a very long time. Yes, we had the riots in 2011, which were exercises in mass looting, but this is very, very different. Let's be clear. Thugs setting fire to hotels, migrant hotels with people in them, is just wrong at every level. I understand the frustrations. I understand the anger that is felt by huge numbers of people, but I do not support street protest, violence or thuggery in any way. And that's why for 30 years I've fought elections, because I believe that democracy is the peaceful way to solve problems. And as for the Tommy Robinsons and those that genuinely do stir up hatred, well, I've never had anything to do with them. In fact, I was the one person above all that got rid of the BNP as an electoral threat. So as for what is being said by the Anna Soubries of this world, the Andy McDonalds from Labour of this world, the accusation that somehow I'm orchestrating these riots, nothing could be further from the truth. We've even got national broadcasters like James O'Brien calling them the Farage riots. This is unfair, untrue, and actually it's directly inciting violence against me. Indeed, over the weekend, I've had to have a massive uplift in personal security. And that's been advised by government agencies. So all this peace and love that we hear from those on the left simply isn't true. The Prime Minister has misread this completely and utterly. Just to call out the actions of the far right is to misunderstand two things. Firstly, let's be clear, there were masked Muslim extremist mobs, some with weapons.
They argue for a more nuanced, evidence-based approach that tackles the root causes of inequality and discrimination, emphasizing the need for policies that build trust and promote inclusivity, rather than restricting immigration and increasing law enforcement measures.
Going around the streets of Midlands and northern cities, threatening journalists literally running away. Indeed, in some cases, people even having their tyres on their cars slashed. So of course, as with every major conflict in life, there is fault, serious fault on both sides. But behind the extremes of both, what Starmer doesn't understand, and when he says, I'm going to stop the far right, What he doesn't understand is the general feeling of dissatisfaction that has been out there in this country growing for years. I talked in the general election about societal breakdown. What I meant by that were communities being split apart, people not even recognising the centres of some of our towns and cities as even being vaguely English anymore. And when it comes to the issue of two-tier policing, something which Keir Starmer denies, I promise you this perception began back at the time of Black Lives Matter. Remember? Churchill's statue being defaced, the cenotaph being abused in central London. And the police response? They knelt down in the street and took the knee to a Marxist organisation that wants to bring down Western civilization. And it goes on and on from there. Compare the policing to the riots in Leeds with the policing that happened at Southport. And look, I am not having a go at individual men and women serving as police officers. I'm appalled that so many have been very badly hurt over the course of the last few weeks. I'm talking about the direction of policing. Is it any wonder that the boss of the Met, Sir Mark Rowley, brushed away a microphone yesterday when he was asked about two-tier policing? Priti Patel, you're wrong on this. Keir Starmer, you're wrong on this. Most of us think that ethnic minority groups are policed entirely differently to that of white British people. Folks, that is what the country feels, that is what the country thinks, and there is evidence to back it up. We can quell these riots, of course we can. We can use force, we can put people in prison. After all, there's lots of room in the prisons now, after we've let so many people out. We can do all of those things.
Farage's plan, though appealing to some, faces the challenge of potentially exacerbating the very issues it aims to resolve.
Bring the army in, if we absolutely need to. We can stop the riots in the short term, but, and here's the important thing, do we want to deal with the symptom that we're seeing today, or solve the problem? Dealing with the symptom will turn us into France, where these flare-ups, these racial tensions between the Muslim community and the French right flare up month after month, year after year, leaving big parts of Marseille and Paris effectively no-go zones. Is that what we want? Or do we want to actually solve the problem? And I believe we can solve the problem. We need to end mass immigration now, to send a message to people. We understand that a 10 million population increase has put massive pressure on people's lives. We need to deal with the young men, undocumented young males, crossing the English Channel. Just today we learn that the Labour government are going to close down the hotels, close down the RAF camps like Wethersfield and Scampton, close down, as we learned last week, the Bibby Stockholm. They're going to put all these people now into government and private rented accommodation. So if your kids are trying to buy a house, trying to rent a house, or trying to get onto a social housing list, they've now been put even further to the back of the queue. Do you think that is going to solve any of these tensions, any of these problems? I promise you that it won't. We have to be clear that whilst we've always been open to genuine refugees, no one that crosses the English Channel trafficked in a small dinghy will ever get refugee status. And thirdly, we absolutely need to get all the police chiefs around the whole of the United Kingdom together and to say to them, start policing even-handedly. Treat everybody in Britain and be colourblind, absolutely colourblind. If you're operating stop and search in an area that happens to have a higher black population, remember, most of those that are being murdered are black. End this constant discrimination. End this diversity agenda. Treat everybody in Britain equally. And if we do those things, we'll remove many of the underlying tensions that exist in our country. And I put that to Sir Keir Starmer as a challenge. We're not even 100 days in to this first Labour government in 14 years. Remember, of course, he doesn't have much legitimacy anyway. The party only got 33.8% of those that voted. Only 20% of the eligible electorate put this man in power. He needs to start listening to the people. And the vast majority of people are decent, are law-abiding, support British values, believe that this is a great country, as I do, but are fearful. Fearful for the future, the integrity of family, community, and nation. And I really believe we're at quite a perilous point. If we allow all of those things that we've built, defended over centuries, if we allow all of those things to come under threat, then we are in very, very big trouble. We will decline down the order of countries in this world. And remember, we're envied by most of the world. Our form of democratic government, the way we've always organized ourselves. It's one of the reasons why so many people actually want to come here. There are many, many good things about us. So look, of course we must deal with violence wherever it comes from and deal with it ruthlessly. But please, Prime Minister, don't use the narrative that anybody that is concerned about excess immigration, about illegal immigration, about population explosion, about change in our communities, do not allow them to think they're what you're calling far right, because I tell you what, they're not.
True progress may require embracing diversity, strengthening social safety nets, and fostering greater understanding between communities and authorities.